There was concern that Bin Laden could oppose capture operations, and indeed he did resist. Mr. Carney said resistance does not require a firearm, giving a more complete account than the administration has offered before. He said during the raid, 2 AlQueada couriers were killed in Bin Laden's building, as was a woman shot in a crossfire. Bin Laden and his family were found on the second and third floors of the building, in a room with Bin Laden, Osama Bin Laden. Another woman, Bin Laden's wife, rushed the US assaulter and was shot in the leg, but not killed. Mr. Carney said Bin Laden was then shot and killed. Senior figures in Britain and France gave warning of the risk that Al-Qaeda and its affiliates might try to carry out a revenge attack after the assassination of Bin Laden, urging that their citizens to be vigilant of the prospect, writes James Blitz in London. Now, this is where it becomes controversial, because I've always been against waterboarding and torture as a way to gain intelligence, but the Financial Times is obviously not going to listen to that critique. Robert Bayer and Michael Schur, who were intelligence experts, were also vague on whether they believed or did not believe in waterboarding. I think Robert Bayer more strongly believed in waterboarding than Michael Schur, but there are several CIA operatives, such as Ray McGovern, who believed that waterboarding was wrong. Let's listen to what the Financial Times says. Richard McGregor in Washington. Champions of waterboarding resurfaced to claim a big result. The head of the House of Representatives Homeland Security Committee could barely contain itself when asked on Fox News to tell viewers how the US found Osama bin Laden. You mentioned the fact that we obtained vital information several years ago about the courier for Osama. We obtained that information through waterboarding, said Peter King, a New York Republican. Well, those who say that waterboarding does not work, Mr. King concluded with the answer to end all the questions. The practice gave the US vital information that directly led us to bin Laden. The giddy and jubilant response in the US, both on the streets and in the corridors of power, has been as bipartisan as it is real. America's intelligence agencies and special forces put on a virtuoso display of skill and might in tracking and finding bin Laden and then killing him in a daredevil raid deep inside another country. In many ways, the raid was a momentary reprise of the nation's unpopular moment before its overseas wars and financial crisis drained confidence from the country and its populace. The euphoria will not last, of course. However much one might blame the US predicament on bin Laden, whose attacks led the Americans into a costly, debilitating, decade-long war in Afghanistan and less directly in Iraq as well. Of course, the United States is only paying 1% of its GDP on the war on terror. It's around $1 trillion a year, whereas it's in the Second World War, it was spending nearly 7%. In the Cold War, it's nearly 7% as well in the of GDP. Its main loss of wealth is happening because of the Federal Reserve policy of increasing the money supply and pumping that money supply into the petrodollar, which will eventually reach the hands of the Saudi and bin Laden crime families, which will then be put into the Islamic banking system, thus funding Al-Qaeda. This is an insane policy by the Federal Reserve, as I've said many times. As the report continues, killing bin Laden will not dig the country out of its deep fiscal hole. Barack Obama, the president, was already hard at work on Monday night trying to keep the bipartisan flame alight, hosting a White House dinner for congressional leaders and their partners. The dinner was arranged weeks ago, but the standing ovation he received would not have happened without Bin Laden's death. Whether the goodwill can flow through to the fractious budget talks is doubtful. As Mr. King's comments make clear, even in the glowing bipartisan moments, the political divide is permanent. Emphasis on whether waterboarding ignores all the other strings that the intelligence community pull on to track Bin Laden, from phone intercepts and the National Security Agency to old-fashioned techniques such as following the couriers around Pakistan. There is also doubt about whether Mr. King is right about the detainee in question, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was waterboarded 183 times. The intelligence community's version of his waterboarding is much more nuanced. Yes, the detainee helped, officials have said, not by confirming the courier's identity, but by his reticence to speak about him, which indicated to the Central Intelligence Agency that the courier was important. Furthermore, what logical deduction that is? What information he did give was not when he was waterboarded. If this is the definition of a successful interrogation and justification for torture, then Mr. King, who has recently convened hearings through his Committee on the Threat of Domestic Islamic Terrorism, is setting a very low bar. Late on Tuesday, he admitted his claim about waterboarding was from a private source. Waterboarding was torture, and whatever the legal rationales was a mistake, Barack Obama said. The congressman is not alone in asserting that waterboarding, now outlawed in the US, was crucial in finding Bin Laden. Many conservative activists said the same in the wake of the raid. Even Leon Panetta, the outgoing US CIA director, conceded in an interview with the NBC on Tuesday that enhanced interrogation techniques, i.e. torture, were used against detainees, but cautioned that it was an open question whether other methods would not have got the same information. It is a difficult debate for the administration. Mr. Obama denounced waterboarding during 2008 campaign and again after his election. Mr. Obama said, "I believe that waterboarding was torture, and whatever its legal rationales were used, it was a mistake." He said, Mr. Obama's pre-election committee to close Guantanamo Bay has fallen by the wayside because of his failure to keep Congress on side with the policy and the difficulties in getting other countries to accept detainees. But the awkward issues raised by the likes of Mr. King endure. That keeping and even torturing the detainees has kept the US safe. For a president who has won great praise for the success of the operation, it is not a comfortable thought. Well, what must we do to defeat AlQueada? We must break all economic, political and military connections, except military connections around AlQueada, so it's completely isolated. And with the death of Bin Laden, it will eventually, through incremental Fabian Western way of war, we will eventually see fractious conflicts within Al-Qaeda about who's in charge and about its core Al-Qaeda's and the Bin Laden's control over the various affiliates. Or will they just let it run and spread like as a movement? Because Al-Qaeda is both a private army of the Bin Laden crime family and Saudi crime family, as core Al-Qaeda is in Pakistan and Afghanistan. It is also a movement that has deep roots in Yemen, and which the offshoot, which is in tiny cells,